January 3, 1868, Edo Castle, the largest fortress complex on Earth. Behind walls 40 feet thick, the 15th Tokugawa Shogun sits in chambers designed to project eternal authority. For 265 years, 15 generations, this family controlled Japan with surgical precision. 40,000 samurai retainers, 270 subordinate domains, a police state so efficient that crime statistics approached zero. But in the streets beyond those walls, imperial banners advance. By nightfall, the shogun will surrender power his ancestors held for longer than the United States has existed. How does an empire collapse in a single day? Stand at the base of Edo Castle today, in what is now the heart of Tokyo, and try to imagine the scale. The outer moat alone stretched 9 miles around the castle grounds. The stone ramparts, assembled without mortar from boulders weighing up to 18 tons each, rose in tiers that seemed to defy geometry. 3 million workers moved 20 million cubic meters of earth to construct the defenses. Inside, the Hanmaru, the innermost citadel, contained palaces where every sliding door, every tatami mat, every ceiling panel communicated hierarchy. The Tokugawa family didn't just rule Japan. They redesigned it. From 1603 to 1868, this single clan orchestrated what historians call the Pax Tokugawa, 2.5 centuries of almost uninterrupted peace in a nation previously torn by constant civil war. The population doubled. Literacy rates climbed higher than Europe's. Edo grew into a city of over 1 million people, larger than London or Paris. Theater flourished. Woodblock prints captured everyday life in exquisite detail. Rice yields increased through agricultural innovation. The merchant class accumulated wealth that would have been unthinkable generations earlier. But beneath this achievement lay something darker, a control mechanism so thorough, so invasive, so paranoid in its precision, that it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Every feudal lord was required to maintain a residence in Edo and leave family members behind as permanent hostages when returning to their domains. The Senkan Katai system of alternate attendance drained provincial resources through mandatory processions to the capital. Thousands of samurai, servants, and porters marching hundreds of miles in elaborate displays that bankrupted domains while keeping them loyal through financial dependence. The Tokugawa controlled which domains could repair castle walls, who could marry whom among the aristocracy, what books could be printed, which foreigners could land on Japanese shores. They built Japan into a fortress. Then they locked it from the inside. For 265 years, it worked. 15 shoguns succeeded one another. The samurai class transformed from warriors into bureaucrats, their swords symbolic, their stipends paid in rice that many converted to cash they barely understood. Peasant uprisings, erupted regularly. 55 major rebellions punctuated the Tokugawa era, each suppressed, each a warning sign ignored. The system appeared unshakable. But in July 1853, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay, belching smoke, mounted with cannons, carrying a letter from American President Millard Fillmore. Commodore Matthew Perry demanded trade. He would return the next year for an answer. The Tokugawa had built their power on controlling information, controlling movement, controlling change itself. What happens when the outside world refuses to stay outside? To understand the collapse, you must understand the founding ambition, what Tokugawa Ieyasu set out to achieve in 1600 when he stood on the blood-soaked field of Sekigahara, the largest samurai battle in Japanese history, and saw his rivals' armies destroyed. Ieyasu was 60 years old. He had survived assassination attempts, betrayals, forced alliances, and the deaths of 2 sons. He had watched Japan tear itself apart in the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, when the country fragmented into dozens of domains locked in perpetual conflict. He had served under 2 previous unifiers, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, learning from their successes and crucially from their failures. Nobunaga had been assassinated by a subordinate. Hideyoshi's heirs had been too young to hold power. Ieyasu would not make those mistakes. Within 3 years of Sekigahara, he had himself appointed shogun military dictator and established his capital at Edo, strategically positioned in the Kanto, plain away from the traditional power centers of Kyoto and Osaka. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a ceremonial figurehead stripped of all political authority but preserved as a source of legitimacy. This was Ieyasu's genius. He didn't abolish the imperial institution. He mummified it, keeping it just alive enough to consecrate Tokugawa rule while ensuring it posed no threat. Then he built the system that would outlast him. The Bakuhan structure divided Japan into approximately 270 domains, han each governed by a daimyo lord who pledged absolute loyalty to the shogun. But loyalty was enforced through architecture. The Sankin Katai system of alternate attendants transformed infrastructure into chains. Domain lords spent fortunes on road maintenance, bridge construction, and inn networks, all to facilitate their mandatory journeys to Edo, where they lived in mansions sized according to their domain's rice production and kept wives and heirs as permanent hostages. Ieyasu's successors refined the system further. The third shogun, Iemitsu, closed Japan to the outside world through Sakoku edict starting in 1633. Christianity was brutally suppressed, believers crucified, burned, tortured into apostasy. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637–38, where Christian peasants held out in a castle for months before being massacred, ended with 37,000 dead and Japan's door slammed shut. Only a handful of Dutch traders were permitted to remain, confined to an artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, allowed to conduct business once per year under suffocating restrictions. For the next 220 years, Japan would have almost no contact with the outside world. The Tokugawa didn't know it yet, but they had made a catastrophic wager. That time could be frozen, that change could be outlawed, that a social order could be preserved in amber indefinitely. They created 4 rigid classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, and made it illegal to move between them. They banned firearms, effectively removing from Japan a technology that had been crucial to battlefield dominance only decades earlier. They established legal codes so detailed that they regulated the size of houses commoners could build, the patterns on kimono they could wear, even the hairstyles appropriate to each class. Neo-Confucian philosophy, imported from China and adapted to Japanese circumstances, became state orthodoxy. Loyalty, hierarchy, filial piety, these values were drilled into every level of society through education, religious institutions, and neighborhood surveillance networks. 5 family units called gun-and-gumi made neighbors responsible for each other's behavior. Informers were rewarded. Dissent was crushed. For generations, it worked brilliantly. The population remained stable. Culture flourished within prescribed boundaries. The samurai collected their stipends and performed administrative functions. Peasants farmed. Merchants accumulated wealth, but remained officially at the bottom of the social hierarchy, forbidden from political participation. But systems built on stasis cannot adapt. And in the mid-19th century, adaptation became survival. The arithmetic turned brutal slowly, then all at once. By the 1850s, the Tokugawa financial structure had become unsustainable. The samurai class, roughly 6% of the population, consumed approximately 25% of the national rice production through hereditary stipends. These warriors no longer fought. They had become bureaucrats, teachers, administrators, their swords ceremonial, their martial skills atrophied through generations of peace. Yet they still received payments based on stipend levels established 2 centuries earlier, when their ancestors had fought at Sekigahara. The domains couldn't afford it. Many were already deeply indebted to merchant houses, borrowing against future rice harvests to maintain the lifestyle Sankin Katai demanded. The Tokugawa themselves borrowed from wealthy merchants to maintain Edo Castle and the vast administrative apparatus required to police a nation of 30 million people. But the real erosion was deeper, philosophical, psychological. The merchant class, officially at the bottom of the Confucian social hierarchy, controlled the economy. They financed domain operations, managed currency exchange, operated lending networks. Samurai in increasing numbers abandoned their status to become merchants, or adopted merchant heirs to inject capital into failing families. The rigid class system that was supposed to ensure stability instead created perverse incentives and hidden resentments. Then came the uprisings. 55 major peasant rebellions erupted during the Tokugawa period, each one a symptom of systemic stress. The Tenmei famine of the 1780s killed hundreds of thousands. The Tempo famine of the 1830s killed hundreds of thousands more. Peasants paid crushing taxes, often 40 to 50% of rice yields, to support samurai stipends and domain expenses. When harvests failed, they starved while samurai ate. When they protested, they were executed, sometimes entire villages, leaders crucified as examples. The most revealing uprising came in 1837, the Oshio Heihaphero Rebellion in Osaka. Oshio was a low-ranking samurai official, a Neo-Confucian scholar, who witnessed mass starvation during the Tempo famine while rice warehouses remained full, their contents held for speculation. He sold his library, bought weapons, and led an armed revolt. It was crushed within a day. Oshio committed suicide, but the psychological impact rippled for decades. A samurai, member of the ruling class, had rebelled against the system in the name of Confucian virtue the system claimed to embody. The contradiction was becoming undeniable. How could a government claim Confucian legitimacy rule based on virtue, benevolence, righteousness, while presiding over mass starvation and economic exploitation? By mid-century, domain governments faced impossible choices: maintain traditions and go bankrupt, or pursue economic reforms that undermined the ideological basis of their authority. Some domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu in western Japan, began quiet modernization efforts. They smuggled Western books despite sakoku restrictions. They experimented with new agricultural techniques. They reorganized samurai into more efficient military units. The Tokugawa government noticed but couldn't respond effectively. Paranoid about any domain accumulating power, they had spent 2 centuries preventing exactly the kind of initiative that could have strengthened Japan against external threats. The system designed to ensure stability instead ensured stagnation. And then the black ships arrived. Commodore Perry's squadron in 1853 represented everything the Tokugawa had tried to prevent. Western technology, steam power, rifled cannons, industrial manufacturing had advanced exponentially during Japan's isolation. Perry's ships could have destroyed Edo's coastal defenses without sustaining damage. The shogun's advisors knew it. Perry knew they knew it. The Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 opened 2 ports to American ships. The Harris Treaty of 1858 established full diplomatic and trade relations. More treaties followed with Britain, France, Russia, the Netherlands. Extraterritoriality clauses meant foreigners accused of crimes in Japan would be tried in their own consular courts, a profound humiliation that advertised Tokugawa weakness. The unequal treaties exposed the central lie of the Tokugawa system: that the shogun protected Japan, that isolation meant security, that the old order could continue forever. Opposition crystallized around a powerful slogan: Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It was perfect rhetoric, nationalistic, traditionalist, yet implicitly revolutionary. By elevating the emperor, it undermined the shogun. By demanding expulsion of foreigners, it attacked the treaties the shogun had signed. The movement drew samurai from domains that had always resented Tokugawa dominance, particularly Choshu and Satsuma. Behind closed doors, something more radical was developing. Young samurai began reading forbidden Western texts. They learned about constitutional government, industrial development, national conscript armies. They realized Japan's survival required not restoration of the old order, but revolutionary transformation. The Tokugawa faced an impossible paradox. They could resist reform and face foreign domination, or embrace reform and undermine their own legitimacy. Either path led to their destruction. By 1866, the question was no longer whether the Tokugawa would fall, but how violently and what would replace them. The Boshin War began with a coup disguised as a restoration. On January 3, 1868, samurai from Satsuma, Choshu, and allied domains seized the Kyoto imperial palace and declared an imperial restoration. Emperor Meiji, a 16-year-old who had spent his entire life as a ceremonial prisoner, was suddenly the source of all political authority. The shogunate was abolished. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th and final shogun, was ordered to return all lands and titles to imperial control. It was brilliant propaganda. The rebels framed their coup as restoration of the natural order, not revolution. They could claim traditionalist legitimacy while pursuing radical modernization. Yoshinobu was trapped. Fight, and he would be labeled a rebel against the sacred emperor, the very institution the Tokugawa had preserved to legitimize their own rule. Surrender, and 265 years of family power would evaporate. He tried negotiation. The rebels demanded unconditional surrender. He mobilized forces. 15,000 men marched toward Kyoto in January 1868 at Toba Fushimi. On the outskirts of the city, they met 5,000 rebels who had secured imperial banners. The Battle of Toba Fushimi should have been a Tokugawa victory based on numbers alone. Instead, it became the emblem of everything wrong with the shogunate's military. The Tokugawa forces fought in traditional formation, samurai leading asagaru conscripts, many still carrying swords and spears. The rebel forces had spent years training with Western rifles and artillery, organizing troops into modern military units. They decimated Tokugawa ranks. More importantly, they fought under imperial banners. When Tokugawa commanders saw those flags, psychological paralysis set in. Their entire worldview loyalty to the shogun as the emperor's military deputy collapsed in cognitive dissonance. Units defected. Others simply stopped fighting. Yoshinobu fled back to Edo Castle. Within weeks, he realized the position was hopeless. The rebels controlled western and central Japan. Foreign powers, watching carefully, showed no inclination to support the losing side. Yoshinobu's advisors split between those urging resistance and those counseling surrender. In April 1868, Yoshinobu made the final decision. He would surrender Edo Castle without a fight to prevent the destruction of the city and its million inhabitants. It was an act of profound pragmatism that saved countless lives. It was also the last meaningful decision a Tokugawa shogun would ever make. On April 11, 1868, imperial forces entered Edo Castle. Yoshinobu had already retired to Kandaiji Temple, head shaved, dressed in Buddhist robes, removing himself from political life. He was 30 years old. He would live another 45 years in comfortable retirement, painting, taking photographs, writing poetry. A living ghost of an extinct order. Fighting continued in northern Japan through 1869. The Aizu domain, fiercely loyal to the Tokugawa, resisted for months. When their castle finally fell, survivors retreated to Hokkaido and established the short-lived Republic of Ezo, Japan's first experiment with representative government, which lasted 5 months before being crushed. The final Tokugawa loyalists surrendered in June 1869. The total death toll, around 120,000 across 18 months, was remarkably low for a civil war that ended 265 years of rule. The Sengoku period had been far bloodier. The American Civil War, fought simultaneously, killed 600,000. The relatively low casualties reflected not pacifism, but how thoroughly the Tokugawa system had already collapsed internally before the external conflict began. By 1869, the new Meiji government began dismantling everything the Tokugawa had built. The Han domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures under central control. The samurai class was eliminated, stipends converted to bonds, then discontinued entirely. The wearing of swords was banned. A national conscript army replaced the warrior aristocracy. Most revolutionary of all, the government sent missions to Europe and America to study Western institutions and import wholesale the technologies, legal systems, and political structures that would transform Japan from a feudal society to an industrial power within a single generation. The Tokugawa had spent 265 years preventing change. The Meiji government would compensate with change so rapid it verged on violence. Today, nothing remains of Edo Castle's inner palaces. American firebombing during World War II incinerated the wooden structures that had survived earthquake, fire, and time. The Imperial Palace now occupies the grounds, modern buildings behind ancient stone walls, the emperor living where shoguns once ruled. But the walls remain those massive stone ramparts, assembled without mortar by workers who died by the hundreds from accidents and exhaustion. Stand before them now and feel the weight of ambition that moved those stones into place. The moats are still filled with water. Cherry trees planted centuries ago still bloom each spring, drawing millions of visitors who photograph beauty built atop buried histories. The Tokugawa story raises uncomfortable questions about power, stability, and the price of peace. They achieved something extraordinary. 2.5 centuries of almost uninterrupted peace in a society that had known only war. Culture flourished, arts developed, population grew. By the metrics they would have recognized, they succeeded beyond their ancestors' wildest ambitions. Yet they built a system so rigid it couldn't adapt, so paranoid it couldn't learn, so committed to stasis that it guaranteed eventual collapse. They closed Japan to protect it and instead left it vulnerable. They froze social hierarchies to ensure stability and instead created the resentments that exploded in revolution. They preserved the emperor as a legitimizing symbol, and he became the banner under which rebels destroyed them. 55 uprisings weren't anomalies. They were warnings that peasants were starving, that the economy was failing, that ideological contradictions were becoming unbearable. The Tokugawa heard the warnings and tightened control instead of adapting. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how completely they were forgotten. Within a generation of the Meiji Restoration, educated Japanese studied European history more thoroughly than their own recent past. The Tokugawa era became synonymous with backwardness, isolation, stagnation, everything modern Japan was determined not to be. But history doesn't offer simple lessons. The Tokugawa gave Japan 2 centuries of peace. They also made Japan so fragile that when change finally came, it came as an earthquake. Stand before those walls, feel the weight of the stones, and ask yourself, how long can any order last when it's built on preventing tomorrow? The Tokugawa clan ruled Japan longer than the United States has existed, controlled one of the most sophisticated police states in pre-modern history, and maintained peace through architectural genius, paranoid bureaucracy, and the calculated preservation of an emperor they had reduced to irrelevance. Then that emperor's name destroyed them in a war that lasted 18 months. Their fortress became his palace. Their system became a cautionary tale. And Japan hurtled into the future they had spent 265 years trying to prevent. The crown didn't fall because of 55 uprisings. It fell because each uprising was a crack they plastered over instead of a foundation they repaired. By the time they noticed the walls were crumbling, there was no structure left to save, only the choice of whether to surrender the castle or watch it burn with them inside. They chose surrender. History remembers them for what they prevented, not what they built. Perhaps that's the coolest legacy of all.